Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlook here. So I wanted to make a video talking about how to write a public policy analysis paper. Um, so when writing a public policy analysis paper, it's not just about describing a policy. It's not just describing about what a policy is. It's about carefully examining a real world problem, evaluating how policymakers have attempted to address it, and then making an evidence-based recommendation for what should be done going forward. So think of this assignment as stepping in the shoes of a policy advisor. Your job is to then help decision makers and the public understand why this issue matters and what can be done about it. So every strong policy paper begins with an introduction that captures attention. It doesn't have to be as flashy as, say, when you were writing in high school about trying to grab people's attention. Because when you write a paper like this, it's probably going to be for an assignment that a professor gave you, or when you're done with university, when you're out in the real world, if you're working for a policy advisor, an organization, that you have to actually write these. It does help to give, if you want, you can give relatively early a striking statistic, a recent news headline, maybe a compelling example that shows the urgency of the issue. Probably doesn't have to be as flashy or as much of a hook as, say, when you were writing maybe for a broader audience. A public policy paper, it's pretty clear why you are writing it and what you're trying to achieve, but still, if you want to try to hook readers relatively early. So from there, in the introduction, try to provide some background so the reader understands the context. Why did this policy emerge? What problem was it meant to address? And why does it matter today? Most importantly, end your introduction with a clear thesis or research question. For example, you might write something as cut and dry as this paper evaluates whether U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods have achieved their stated goal of improving economic security. When I'm writing in the papers that I've written in the past, in my dissertation, I like very bold, upfront questions like that. I don't want to leave the reader guessing what this paper is about. I'm pretty flexible, and we've all seen in academic journals and policy papers how much flowery language is in the introduction. Those pieces, like, there's a lot of ambiguity. It depends a lot on your writing style. But what I like to see is a very clear. I want the writer, the author of the piece, to tell me what I am going to get out of this paper. I think that makes it so much easier. And you, as a writer, make sure you're telling the reader, this is what this paper is going to do. This is what you're going to get out of it. Put that in the introduction. Make it clear. Tell the scope, what you're going to be writing about. That way there's not a surprise to the reader, and that way the reader doesn't interpret it how they want to. Tell them this is what this paper is going to do. So, in a public policy paper, you'll need to clearly define the problem. Too often, we see that papers stay vague, but this is where you convince your reader why they should care. Define the problem definition. What specific problem is the policy trying to solve? What evidence do we have that it's a problem? Do you have data? Do you have historical patterns? Do you have social or economic trends? And why is the problem worth solving for policymakers and the public? So for instance, it's probably not enough to say healthcare is expensive. But if you want to write on healthcare and think about healthcare, you need to specify who's impacted, what are the consequences are, and why the status quo is unsustainable, or maybe why a different policy program would work better than the status quo. So then you move on to like your policy description. So you've established the problem, turn to describing the policy response. What exactly does the policy do? What mechanisms are in place? Regulations, subsidies, taxes, maybe mandates? Who is the target population? Which agencies, organizations, or actors are responsible for carrying it out? So we joked in class that the first couple readings of class were kind of boring and kind of a little bit dry. But I talked about how these understandings of the different power players in politics, the different levels of governing structures, play a role in public policy. And here, when you're talking about the policy description, we start to see why some of that reading was important. Because it helps set up our thinking of writing a policy analysis. As we said in class, some of the nuts and bolts of public policy analysis were in these early readings, and now we're understanding why. So we can see, can you explain the policy in a clear, accessible terms that anyone, even someone unfamiliar with the issue, can understand? When you're writing, try to avoid jargon. Imagine you're explaining it to a friend who doesn't study, or doesn't really pay attention to politics. And then maybe you can move on to the next piece of your paper. The heart of your paper is the analysis. This is where you evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of the policy. Where has it worked well? Is there evidence of efficiency, fairness, success? When it has fallen short, are there gaps, problems with implementation, or strong political opposition? Don't forget trade-offs. Almost every policy produces both benefits and costs and unintended consequences. For example, stricter environmental standards. For example, stricter environmental standards may reduce pollution, but raise costs for certain businesses. Early in the first couple days of the semester, this is really what we were talking about, these trade-offs of public policy. So of course we all want cleaner air, but politics plays a role. If we have just very, very strict environmental regulation, does that actually have an impact on the economy? But if too many people lose jobs in a democracy, that could get an elected official voted out. So they don't want to lose elections. So they have to weigh these issues. So we can see Mazaki, stop that. So we can see the complexity of public policy. Sorry, my dog is digging on the carpet. So as you're thinking about your analysis, you can consider alternatives. How do other states, countries, past policies address similar problems? Comparative perspectives sometimes strengthen your analysis and prevent the paper from becoming one-sided. So you're showing that, okay, you also thought about... So what else we encountered in the reading is that no policy exists in a vacuum. It is shaped by politics. So you might have a stakeholder analysis piece, which section of your paper, which asks who are the stakeholders, who supports the policy and opposes it, and why. Stakeholders might include interest groups, political parties, businesses, bureaucracies, or segments of the public. Consider their incentives and power. Are powerful lobbies influencing the policy? Is there widespread public support, or is the issue highly partisan? Mapping out these dynamics will help you understand not only whether the policy is good on paper, but whether it is politically viable. So if you introduce into your paper evaluation, here you can step back and think about it from a more analytical standpoint. How do we judge whether the policy is effective? Think in terms of efficiency. Is it cost effective? Maybe this ties in with some of those earlier pieces of comparison. Has something worked in one place and it actually ended up being cheaper? Did it work better? Does the distribution of benefits fairly help people across groups? Feasibility, is it realistic to implement? Again, is this something that can actually be implemented, these changes? Political viability. Can it survive with current partisan climate? Is it realistic to be passed? So when you write your recommendation piece, and I know everyone's policy recommendations look different, what you're looking at looks different, but when you give your recommendation, this is where you step into the role of the policy advisor. Your recommendation should be clear, specific, and evidence-based. So pulling in things that you've written earlier. Is it cheaper? Does it provide better services? Now this depends a lot on what public policy you're looking at for your paper. Is it something that you're just looking to do cheaper? So you might suggest modifying the current policy, scaling it back, expanding it, introducing an alternative. But remember, your recommendation has to be realistic. Policymakers rarely adopt the, quote, ideal solution. Instead, think about what could realistically pass in today's political environment. So throughout the semester, we'll talk about writing the public policy paper. I can give some examples. Remember, everyone's going to look slightly different. We're all writing on different public policy issues, and so your papers will look different. But I know, as we talked about in class, the readings for week 1 and week 2 were pretty thick, kind of pretty jargon heavy, and they may have been kind of boring for you. But the key points there were they were building the framework to help you write a public policy analysis, to think about evaluating public policy. So between the readings, watching through this lecture, and then we'll talk about it in class, I think we'll be well positioned to write quality public policy analysis papers. Okay, thank you.